The year is 1995, and the monsoon season begins in North Korea. Starting at the end of June, it rains for 10 days straight. By then, 23 inches of water covers the state collectivized rice paddies. The ensuing starvation kills 2 to 5% of the nation's 22 million strong population. The survivors would soon call this period the Arduous March. This is the story of North Korea's famine. Unlike other communist states, North Korea's collectivization of agriculture in the 1950s went relatively well. There was no period of famine, but food was still scarce. The 1945 partition of the Korean peninsula had left the north with the bulk of Korea's natural resources, but had left most of the farmland in the south. There were few areas in the north capable of being worked agriculturally. The war had also decimated the north, especially through a catastrophic bombing campaign from the United States. Despite this, the North managed to industrialize before the South, starting in the 1950s. The state emphasized an industrial approach to agriculture, using mechanization, chemicalization, and irrigation to do so. Huge amounts of chemical fertilizer were especially relied on. This resulted in one of the world's most input-intensive agricultural systems. But it functioned. While never reaching luxurious levels, people generally had enough to eat. So what changed? Starting in the 1980s, North Korea's food system began to crack. The food provided by the government began to shrink in size, and the economy overall was deteriorating. Food in North Korea was handed out through a public distribution service, or PDS system. Farmers received their allotted rations after their crops were harvested. The urbanized majority instead received coupons every 15 days that were redeemed at a state store. These were primarily for grain, although sometimes coupons for cooking oil, vegetables, and on rare occasions, principally major holidays such as Kim Il-sung and later Kim Jong-il's birthday, meat was also distributed. The amount of grain allowed depended on occupation and status. Soldiers, miners, and workers in heavy industry were allotted 900 grams, party members 700, and non-party office workers somewhat less. Starting in the mid-1980s, the system began to break down, with rations being delayed routinely, and by the end of the decade, this had become the norm. Also during this period, the Soviet Union began to fall apart. Long subsidizing North Korea with aid, to the point that the North was largely dependent on the Soviets for various goods, the USSR were forced to increase their prices to the Hermit Kingdom. By the early 1990s, they had nearly ceased their supply of food and oil to the North, and aid shipments from China could not replace the loss. This had a cripplingly effect on the country, whose agricultural system relied on supplies from Russia to function. The North now could only produce an estimated 60% of its food needs. To make up for this, the state began a "Let's Eat 2 Meals Per Day" campaign and labeled rice rations being cut as patriotic price donations to the military. By 1994, a Chinese official reported that the food shortage was the worst in the state's history, but the DPRK continued to deny these reports. Due to the lack of oil, North Koreans began to deforest much of the country for firewood to heat their homes. This had always been, in the past, a common activity, but increased in scale during the 1990s. A lack of trees resulted in ecological damage by fueling erosion. The final blow came in the summer of 1995, when it rained 23 inches of water in a matter of days. It is estimated that the nation lost up to 70% of its annual rice harvest and 50% of its maize. Outright famine soon followed. The PDS system broke down completely after the floods. The country's infrastructure, schools, and hospitals began to crumble. The worst hit were urban North Koreans, who lacked access to supplemental food found in the countryside, like weeds and tree bark. The city of Chongjin, on the northeastern coast, was one of the hardest hit regions. Known for its industrial capacity, its factories fell quiet. Years later, a journalist named Barbara Demick would publish a book on 6 North Korean refugees who had fled the city of Chongjin. I would highly recommend reading it if you want a personal account of day-to-day life in the North during this period. The following is an excerpt from the book which details the devastating impact of starvation on families. Quote, among the homeless population in North Korea, a disproportionate number were children or teenagers. In some cases, their parents had gone off in search of jobs or food. But there was another, even stranger explanation. Facing a food shortage, many North Korean families conducted a brutal triage of their own households. They denied themselves and often elderly grandparents food in order to keep the younger generation alive. That strategy produced an unusual number of orphans, as their children were often the last ones left of entire families that had perished. These children were soon nicknamed the Kochebi, meaning the wandering swallows. The famine lasted for several years and resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 600,000 and 2 million people, out of a population of a little over 20 million. One outcome of the destruction of the PDS system was that average North Koreans began to trade in ad hoc markets outside the grip of the state. In other words, the private market, functionally a black market, spread throughout the country. Most of those who engaged in this illegal but often permitted activities were women, as men were still required to show up for work, even if there was nothing to do and wages were rarely dispersed. Thus, women became major breadwinners. This led to an astonishing change in gender roles in the country, which had always followed a more traditional family structure. As part of this booming black market, illegal trade between China and North Korea also blossomed. Hundreds of thousands of refugees fled to China to seek work and food. This combined led to outside information spreading to the north to a degree not seen before. Outside NGOs were also allowed to enter the country to hand out aid, albeit under strict conditions. Between 1997 and 2004, foreign food donations fed an estimated 1/3 of the country. There are many reasons why North Korea's famine was unique. For example, it happened in a modern industrialized state. The urban class were even at greater danger of death compared to their rural counterparts. This runs contrary to most modern famines. But the one aspect that really drives home the uniqueness is that after the famine, nothing changed. Many outside observers predicted the fall of the state, or at least the governing family, but the Kims still hold to power 30 years later. There were no liberalizing reforms implemented to prevent a similar scenario occurring again. Their strict government-controlled distribution system continued to exist and still does. In fact, the government cracked down severely on the black market in the 2000s, bringing the economy more readily under their control. North Korea went through a generation-defining event, and yet there was virtually no political changes. Regardless, the Arduous March remains the deadliest catastrophe to befall the peninsula since the Korean War. Its tragedy is matched only by its scale. As an Irishman, I am reminded of the Irish famine when I read about North Korea. The potato famine in the 1840s killed 10% of the island. I hope North Korea's future will be as absent of hunger as our present currently is. That's all for today, guys, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.